Welcome to tonight's program on Russia, the United States, and the war in the Ukraine. My name is Carrie Cronin. I'm the director of the Newmarket Public Library, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's presentation. Kurk Dorsey has taught U.S. environmental history and U.S. diplomatic history since 1994 at the University of New Hampshire, where he has won a Teaching Excellence Award and a Graduate Student Mentoring Award. He has published two books, The Dawn of Conservation Diplomacy in 1998 and Whales and Nations 2013, both in the Weyerhaeuser Environmental Book Series from the University of Washington Press. Please welcome Professor Kurk Dorsey.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I just want to make sure the sound is good. Am I coming through loud and clear? All right, thank you. And if I say something that's unclear, there's a breakup in the internet, which sometimes happens. There's a function across the bottom of the screen where reactions, and one of the things if you click on reactions is raise hand, and you'll get a little yellow hand that goes up, and I'll see that if there's some clarification. If you have an in-depth question you want to have discussion about, you can put that in the chat, and Carrie and I will run through that, and I'll have discussion at the end. One great thing about the last couple of years at the university is I've gotten a little bit better at using remote technology. So I think I'm a little bit more competent at doing this. So I'm going to run through through a presentation here, 30, 40 minutes, and then answer questions, and I'll stick around as long as people have questions. And first of all, thank you all for coming out, or I guess staying home in this case, to hear the talk. I appreciate your interest in foreign policy. As I was saying to Carrie, I'm always happy to have an audience. I'm a little sad it's under these circumstances, given what we see in the news out of Ukraine daily, but it is a huge event in the course of the 21st century. This will be one of those events that people will be teaching about for a long time in the way that it shapes the future of the world. And even the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, said the other day that what's going on in Ukraine is not about Russia and Ukraine. It's about a lot more than that. And it was not a very effective defense of what Russia was doing in Ukraine, because the rest of the world looked at it, or many places in the world looked at it and said, yes, and what you're doing is what we're trying to stop. So how we got to the States is pretty important. So the first thing I have up here is a map of Europe, which I think is useful to see, for one thing, just the massive extent of Ukraine, what a large country it is. Not only that Ukraine, the green country here, slightly off center in the map, shares obviously a long border with Russia, but I think the other important country on this map, for what I'm going to try to get to today, is the yellow country above it, Belarus, because the relationship between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus is really critical for understanding what Vladimir Putin is trying to do, and also what it is that the West collectively is trying to respond to and prevent. So, all right, so I hit advance and nothing, there we go. One thing I've learned about Zoom teaching is that the first time you use it, something will go wrong. So I think we've gotten the bug out of the system. So one of the questions that people are asking quite a bit is, what are Vladimir Putin's goals? And this is a question that is very difficult to answer. I've been fortunate over the last, 10 years or so, to be in correspondence with a reporter in Bratislava, Slovakia. He's the deputy foreign affairs minister for the newspaper Pravda, which means truth. Those of us old enough to remember the Cold War remember that Pravda was in the Soviet Union was basically communist propaganda. But this Pravda is a bona fide, fantastic international newspaper. And he and I were communicating back before the war started, but in January, when it was clear that Putin was ratcheting up tensions. And I asked him, a person who studies Eastern European foreign policy, what he thought Putin was up to. And he said, it doesn't make any sense to me. So even seasoned viewers of Russia and American relations and the UN are somewhat stumped by what Vladimir Putin is doing. I put up a series of pictures here that I think emphasize what is motivating Vladimir Putin. And I think the most important one here is the photograph in the lower left-hand corner of Vladimir Putin and his counterpart from Belarus, Lukashenko, President Lukashenko. It seems to me that the core problem that Vladimir Putin faces is a combination of things. One, he wants Russia to have a dominant relation with its two neighbors, Ukraine and Belarus, because he sees, and many Russians would agree with him, that there is a cultural connection among those three countries. And I think what he has seen over the last 2 years, but particularly really over the last 6 months, is Belarus has fallen closer and closer to his orbit, into his orbit, while Ukraine has been getting further and further away. If you had been paying attention to the last year of what's going on in Belarus, you've seen massive protests against President Lukashenko and his attempt to control almost every aspect of Belarusian life. There was a fraudulent election that he won, and I use that term loosely, to make him president for life. And you may remember one of the big stories last summer was that Belarus basically faked a terrorist attack on an airplane to force the airplane to land in its soil so they could arrest two dissidents who were opposed to the Belarusian government. And this was considered a huge outrage. But this is a tactic that Vladimir Putin would have gladly taken on. So on one hand, he's got Belarus coming closer to him, but that's stirring a lot of dissent within Belarus. And one of the reasons it was stirring dissent was because Ukraine was going the other direction. And ordinary people in Belarus could see in Ukraine the possibility of a truly independent country that was separate from Russian influence. And so the picture in the upper right-hand corner is one that I'm sure caused Putin to have heartburn. It's President Zelensky of Ukraine giving a, well, not a handshake, but a fist bump, right? The modern equivalent, the COVID equivalent of a handshake, to Jens Stoltenberg, who is the Secretary General of NATO. I think somebody may still have their microphone on, so if we get, just make sure you mute or we're going to get a lot of feedback. Thank you. I'm not sure, Carrie, if we can mute somebody. Okay, thank you. Many people, particularly people who are, let's see, how can we, I think what we can do about the feedback we're getting.
I think everyone's muted at this time.
Okay, good. I think that fixed it. Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah.
So are you getting feedback or is it just me?
I am. I wonder if it's a person who's calling in. I don't know if can we mute them? Let's try that. Did that do it?
Let's see. I think this is better. Yeah, okay, good. I don't make enough sense when I speak once. If I'm hearing myself 3 or 4 times, I'm really confusing. So the picture of Zelensky and Stoltenberg giving a fist bump was the kind of picture that Putin has pointed to. NATO is expanding up to our borders. This is something we need to respond to. But NATO is not an aggressive institution. It is, if anything, a reflection of the countries that joined NATO living up to certain standards that Vladimir Putin doesn't want. Those are standards of openness, standards of cooperation, standards of treating large and small states as equals. The reality about NATO is that Estonia has a vote and the United States has a vote. You know, these two vastly disparate countries have the same say. So I think that's what's troubling. At the same time, a couple things that I think we need to keep in mind about Vladimir Putin. We have this picture in the lower right from Victory Day, May of 1945. And you see Russian soldiers holding a number of captured Nazi banners. This is the glory of the Soviet Union, and really, from Putin's mindset, the glory of Russia, when Russia was a major power that had taken down the German army. You know, about 90% of German casualties in World War II were caused by the Russians. And there's this glory that Russia has lost as the Soviet Union fell apart and as its economy fell behind. And Putin is trying to reclaim that. And then finally, I put up a picture of Memorial, which is the human rights organization that started right at the end of the Cold War and was shut down in December of last year, right before this war started. And I don't think that's coincidental. The thing about Memorial is it was a thorn in Putin's side because it kept challenging his version of events within Russia and challenging his political control because it believed in an open democratic order. And Putin shut it down right before the war because I think he recognized that the war might be unpopular at home and he didn't want to have this organization causing trouble for him. So more than anything, I think Putin saw that, or believed that if he was going to crush Ukraine as a model for what Belarus and other countries close to him could be, he was going to have to do it now. Ukraine was getting stronger and more organized. The longer he waited, the harder he would have pushing Ukraine around the way he wanted Ukraine to act. So we could go back 1,000 years to the deep history between Moscow and Kyiv. There's this long history, and Minsk as well. But I want to focus in on roughly the last 100 years because I think this is when the United States has played an important role. So you'll probably all recognize this gentleman, Woodrow Wilson, on one of his 2 trips to Europe in 1919, when he led the United States in negotiating the Treaty of Versailles. And Wilson had a set of ideas that he laid out in 1918. And the central one of those ideas was self-determination based on nationality. And this was particularly important because he was challenging Vladimir Lenin, who believed in self-determination based on class. Vladimir Lenin said, "Workers of the world unite." Wilson thought that Ukrainians should unite, and Slovenes should unite, and Germans should unite around their nationality. And in the chaos at the end of World War I, a number of new states emerged in Eastern Europe. And you can see this map from 1919 that has an independent Ukraine. The independent Ukraine obviously did not last as an independent country, but new ones like Romania and Poland did last. Ukraine was swallowed up into the Soviet Union in 1921. There's a lot of argument about how much the Ukrainians really wanted that and how much it was the Russians conquering them. But Ukraine's brief existence is tied in this time period is tied to Wilsonian nationalism and Wilsonian self-determination. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States, which was again the most powerful country in the world, returned to some of these core ideas that Wilson had pronounced in 1918 and 1919. Those ideas in 1918, 1919 did not take hold, but after World War II, they did. And we talk about this broadly as the liberal international order. Obviously, there's a lot of factors, political scientists, historians disagree about what all is in the liberal international order. But 2 key things came out of World War II. And part of the reason why the Ukraine war is so important is that they are both challenges to this liberal order that was set up during the war. During the war, European allies and the United States, trying to figure out what caused this huge war so soon after the First World War, came to the conclusion that the problem was an unwillingness to stand up to dictators in the 1930s and a competition for resources that could be solved by more cooperation among countries rather than competition. So the nations of the allied countries formed the United Nations. And this is obviously the seal of the United Nations. And almost every country in the world has joined the United Nations either at the end of World War II when it could, or as soon as it became independent, if you talk about, say, the colonial states of Africa. One of the core principles of the United Nations, it's in Article 2 of the United Nations, is that nations will not solve their disputes by force. They will not try to change borders by force. And connected to that, if one nation tries to use force against another nation to solve a dispute, then all members of the United Nations should do what they can to help the nation that's being attacked. So this is a core principle of post-World War II world order. Big countries cannot conquer small countries. The other part of the process, of course, was the economic part. And so you've got a picture here of 2 prominent economists, Harry Dexter White from the United States and John Maynard Keynes from Great Britain, meeting just up the road in Bretton Woods in June of 1944. And they set up the post-war economic order. There are lots of facets to that. For instance, all currencies in the Bretton Woods system were pegged to the American dollar, which was pegged to gold. So currencies would be stable. They agreed to set up things like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to try to stabilize the world economy. But the key point out of Bretton Woods was that countries should cooperate with one another. They should be open to trading with one another rather than trying to fight each other for natural resources. So these are really the core principles of the post-war liberal international order. They are tied to democracy, but democracy is not inherent in the 2 processes. There are lots of countries that aren't democracies in the UN and in the Bretton Woods system. So democracy is sort of on the side of that. But in general, particularly in Europe, the United States was the main proponent of this liberal international order that dealt with relatively open borders, political cooperation, and where possible, the promotion of democracy. So I'm going to jump ahead into the 1990s when there are 3 key events that are relevant for today that explain partially why the United States has an obligation to be involved, but also why its interests are involved. So the older people in the audience will recognize this gentleman, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. And he inherited a country that had the largest nuclear arsenal in the world and a just completely rotten economy. a comment that is attributed to him, although I'm not sure it's been proven that he said it, is that the Soviet Union was Upper Volta with missiles. And Upper Volta is a very poor African country now known as Burkina Faso. And so his point was that their economy had fallen behind, but all they did was build missiles. So Gorbachev launched a series of reforms that were meant to bring the Soviet Union into the liberal international order, trading freely with other countries, cooperating with the UN, promoting democracy at home. Of course, as probably most of you know, the Soviet Union collapsed instead. It didn't get stronger, it collapsed and divided up into its 15 constituent republics, many of which were based on nationality, at least in the abstract. And all of these states joined the UN and therefore accepted Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, which I mentioned a minute ago, which is that they would not solve their differences by force. So one of those countries, of course, was Ukraine, which for a long time we called the Ukraine, but that was sort of as a region. Now we're talking about the country of Ukraine. When Ukraine became one of the independent states out of the former Soviet Union, it inherited, among other things, 1,900 nuclear warheads that were part of the Soviet arsenal, making it the third largest nuclear power on Earth after the United States and Russia. The problem with this nuclear arsenal was that it was not controlled from Kyiv, it was controlled from Moscow. So these weapons were definitely a mixed blessing. The Ukrainians couldn't control them, they couldn't launch them, but they were a significant bargaining chip and a source of some national pride. So at Budapest, Hungary in 1994, the Ukrainians agreed with the Russians, Americans, and British that they would return their nuclear weapons to Russia and all the launchers, the bombers, everything that was affiliated with the nuclear force. But in exchange, those three countries, Russia, Britain, and the United States, would offer assurances that Ukraine's borders would not be violated. And this is really critical because obviously they would be violated in the 21st century. And you see here the handshake between Bill Clinton, Boris Yeltsin, and the Ukrainian President Kravchuk as they all agree to this concept. I recently read an interesting point that I had not considered until this crisis broke out. The Budapest Agreement says that they are assurances, but not guarantees. Guarantees mean we will come to your defense, where assurances mean that, well, we will do our best to help you, but we're not going to necessarily come to your defense. In any case, clearly the Russians had made a statement that they were not going to cause any damage to Ukraine's borders. So we got the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine getting the Budapest Agreement, trading security of its borders for the nuclear force that it was giving away. And then the third major factor from the 1990s is this question of NATO expansion, which is so much on people's minds. So it's important to remember why NATO was formed. NATO began with the Benelux countries, as they're called, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, like three of the smallest, weakest powers in Europe, formed a mutual defense pact. And it wasn't really aimed at the Russians, it was aimed at the Germans, because this was 1948, and they remembered World War II. And the point of those countries forming together was they wanted to draw on other European countries and eventually draw the United States into making a promise to defend the countries of Europe from invasion. Whether that was German or Russian was a matter that they didn't really care which one, but if one happened, they'd be ready. And so the original North Atlantic Treaty Organization included all the states in black. And for instance, it's kind of, I always find it interesting that Italy apparently is in the North Atlantic. There it is down there in the Mediterranean. So they had a little bit of a loose definition of the North Atlantic. The key piece of NATO is Article 5. Article 5 says an attack on one member is an attack on all. And so if Germany were to attack Denmark, or Russia were, Soviet Union were to attack Norway, every NATO member is obligated to come to the defense of that one nation that's under attack. And obviously this is an important piece of the puzzle for what's happening right now in Eastern Europe. It is important to remember that one of the reasons they formed NATO was to keep an eye on the Germans. In fact, the joke was that the point of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. But then in 1955, West Germany joined NATO. And then in 1990, East Germany rejoined with West Germany. They had been divided at the end of World War II to form a united Germany. And the Soviet Union agreed that East Germany's army would be integrated into West Germany and Germany would remain a NATO member. So this was something that Mikhail Gorbachev accepted as inevitable. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there was a lot of discussion in Europe and in the United States about the future of NATO. Should NATO simply go away? What was the point of NATO if there was no more Soviet Union? Should NATO remain where it was? Or should it expand and include states from Eastern Europe that wanted to join to get the security guarantees? Now, I should point out that there was a counterpart to NATO, which was the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a collection of states to the west of the Soviet Union that were occupied by the Soviet Union, but they formed this alliance nominally to protect themselves against a Western invasion, which was never going to happen. The Allied army was not big enough to invade this part of the world. It was basically to show solidarity in the face of NATO. The Warsaw Pact was not a pact of equals. In fact, one of the jokes I saw recently about the Warsaw Pact was it was the only alliance in history that exclusively attacked its own members, because the Warsaw Pact crushed Hungary and crushed Czechoslovakia in 1956 and 1968. The debate about NATO expansion into the former Warsaw Pact countries came down to this. If we move east towards Russia, are we provoking Russia, which is still a large nuclear power, even if it's in chaos after the fall of the Soviet Union? Or do we move east because countries like Poland deserve to make a decision? And if they want to be in NATO, we should accept them into NATO. We shouldn't let the Russians make decisions for us. And you can see then in that sort of medium green, Poland on top, the Czech Republic in the middle, and Hungary, 2 countries below it, all countries that have been part of the Warsaw Pact, all countries have been occupied by the Russians. They spent the 1990s lobbying to get into NATO. And in 1999, at the 50th anniversary meeting of NATO, those 3 countries were accepted in, setting the stage for NATO to expand into as much of Eastern Europe as NATO could agree to. Countries can't just join NATO, they have to go through a set of processes. You may have heard today, President Zelensky of NATO said, I'm getting ahead of myself, of Ukraine, said that you never again can NATO say that our army isn't good enough to be part of NATO. So there are certain standards that you have to meet to join NATO. And then you can see from the light green portions of the map, other Eastern European countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and then the 3 Baltic states have all joined NATO in the early 21st century. So NATO has been gradually expanding. Now, for a lot of people, that is what has set Vladimir Putin off, and NATO is an expansionistic force that bothers Putin quite a bit. I have a couple of thoughts about that. First of all, NATO has used force twice in its now nearly 70-year history, more than 70-year history. Once after the 9/11 attack, NATO responded and helped the United States in its war in Afghanistan. And then once in the war in the collapsing Yugoslavia in the 1990s, NATO intervened to try to stop the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, but particularly in Kosovo in 1999. So NATO has not been an aggressive state, aggressive union. And if you know anything about politics in the United States, President Trump was saying for quite a long time that NATO wasn't pulling its weight. It wasn't spending enough on defense. So this is hardly an aggressive military alliance. In addition, from the early 1990s, NATO had reached out to all the other states in Europe that were not NATO members and formed a partnership for peace to try to integrate diplomatically. So that included Russia, but also countries traditionally neutral like Sweden and Finland, so that NATO would be as transparent as possible with these countries. And the reality is that the Russians were happy with that in the 1990s. The foreign minister, a guy named Sergei Kozyrev, has written a book about this. He was very open about it. They didn't fear NATO. If anything, they wanted to raise Russia to the standards that it could be possibly integrated into NATO, because NATO was part of this liberal international order. The problem was, starting in 1999, Russia got a new president, Vladimir Putin, and Putin had a very different set of goals. So the larger picture here in the lower left is Putin as a young man when he had just become the leader of Russia. And you see in the background Boris Yeltsin, who had been in charge of Russia since 1991, the first democratically elected president of Russia. Yeltsin was in ill health in 1999, and he basically pulled Vladimir Putin out of St. Petersburg, made him his second in command, and then handed the presidency to him in such a way that Putin was destined to win the next election. And the world didn't really know what to make of Vladimir Putin. He was not a well-known figure. We figured out some things pretty quickly. He had been a KGB agent in the 1970s and 80s. The KGB is the Russian Soviet secret police. He had been stationed in Dresden, East Germany, when the communist movement in East Germany collapsed. And so he had to watch his empire fall apart around him. And then he had been a fairly effective assistant mayor in St. Petersburg, a large city. And so I'm pretty confident that Yeltsin thought that he had democratic instincts, because Yeltsin certainly believed in those himself. And you can see here a couple of images of the West trying to work with Putin. So there's this picture on top from 2005, the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II. And you see various Western leaders standing around Putin like they're all in the same club, treating Russia as one of the 8 industrialized countries of the world, from the G7 as it had been to the G8. George Bush famously was asked after he met Putin the first time if he thought he could work with Putin, since Putin was a former KGB agent. And Bush said that he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul, and he knew that he could work with him. And at this time, Putin was working to put down a rebellion in Chechnya, which he very shrewdly framed to the United States as related to the war on terror, that these were Chechen Muslim terrorists and they had to be stopped. There was an attack on an apartment building in Moscow in 1999 that killed about 300 people, and Putin blamed it on Chechen rebels. There are a lot of Russian specialists who think that it was Putin's own secret police that pulled it off to justify the attack. I don't know that we'll ever know the answer to that, or at least not under Putin's reign. But it wasn't just George W. Bush. Here you have a picture of Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State under Barack Obama, who, as one of her first acts as Secretary of State, met the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, and brought him a reset button. So we're going to try to reset our relations and work with the Russians, because we need to be able to work with the Russians. I think when Putin first became president of Russia, he was a little more open to democratic ways, a little more open to the West. But I think he concluded pretty quickly that he could become more powerful and, frankly, wealthier by cracking down on dissent in his country and slowly removing anybody around him who wanted to be too close to the West. For one thing, being close to the West meant running in elections that he might lose, and he enjoyed being in power too much for that. So this brings us back to Ukraine, and the particular how we got to this particular crisis. So Ukraine has had pretty messy politics since it became independent in 1991. There have been ups and downs swinging between pro-Russian policies and anti-Russian policies. But Ukraine has gradually ironed out a lot of the kinks in democracy. Democracy does not come automatically, and a lot of the traits have to be learned. So in 2013, Viktor Yanukovych, who you see in the center of the picture, center of the screen, was the president of Ukraine. And he made a decision that Ukraine was not going to tie itself more closely to the European Union. Now, a lot of Ukrainians wanted to be tied more closely to the European Union. For one thing, they would have access to move around in the European Union, so they could move to other countries for jobs. They wanted better trade relations with the European Union and to get a little bit further away from Russia. When Yanukovych made that decision, huge protests broke out in cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv, and there was a lot of violence. More than 100 Ukrainians died in battles between the Ukrainian police and protesters who were pushing for, as the sign says, European values: freedom, democracy, human rights, and justice. So Yanukovych, who was clearly more pro-Russian than most Ukrainian leaders, ended up fleeing the country because he felt like he was being persecuted and blamed for what he thought was a legitimate political decision. And it is interesting to note that he is in exile in Russia. He stayed there. And in elections, the Ukrainians elected Petro Poroshenko as their new president, and he began moving Ukraine again more closely towards the West. And I think this is when Putin decided that Ukraine was slipping out of his grasp. So Putin did two important things in response to the Euromaidan protests in 2013 and 14. First, he annexed Crimea. So as you can see on the map on the right, Crimea is more than 90% Russian speaking. It is almost an island. We call it the Crimean Peninsula, but it's almost barely attached to, just barely attached to the mainland. And Crimea is kind of a flashpoint for nationalism between Russia and Ukraine. It was in Ukraine's borders in 1991. So the Budapest Agreement, the UN Charter, all of that says that Crimea is part of Ukraine and it cannot be changed by force. The Russian response is, well, go back to Wilsonian nationalism. These people should have the right to say whether or not they want to be in Russia or Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin sponsored a referendum in the country, which the pro-Russian forces won overwhelmingly, but it probably wasn't a fair election. So we don't really know for sure what the people of Crimea want. In addition, Crimea had been part of Russia until 1954 when it got moved into Ukraine. And if I were to go back to the map from 1919, Crimea was not part of Ukraine in 1919. So it's a very tricky piece of the puzzle, whether or not Crimea naturally belongs to Russia or Ukraine. In any case, it was Ukraine until 2014, and the Russians took it over. The Crimeans formed a government with support of the Russian army, and then immediately negotiated an annexation deal so that Crimea is part of Russia, according to Russia. Almost nobody in the world recognizes that Crimea is part of Russia instead of Ukraine. If you look on the map, you also see that on the right side of the part with the details what percentage of people are Russian speaking, that there are two provinces, well over 60% there in terms of the Russian population. What Putin did was encourage those areas to form separatist governments. And he has been in the process of moving closer and closer to recognizing those as independent states, no longer part of Ukraine. The Ukrainian government obviously does not recognize them. There's been a state of low-level civil war in what's called the Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk, since 2014. So Ukrainians have been fighting there against these Russian separatists, many of whom are in fact Russian soldiers, and they're supported by the Russian government. You may remember a few years ago, about almost a decade ago now, that a Malaysian airliner was shot down over Ukraine, and it was shot down by one of these Buk missile systems. And the plane had left from Amsterdam, are 100% convinced that it was fired by one of these Russian separatists who assumed it was a Ukrainian plane in their airspace, and they shot down an airliner and killed all the people on board, which was more than 250 people. So this was a chaotic zone in Ukraine, and Ukraine has not recognized these states as independent. I think at first, Putin was hoping to force Ukraine to acknowledge the independence of these states. But Ukraine obviously is not going to do that. And I should just say as an aside, one of the oddities of Putin's attempt to force Ukraine to accept that Crimea and the Donbass region are not part of Ukraine is that those people couldn't vote in the last election. And those are the areas that would have produced the most pro-Russian votes. So he basically sliced off a lot of pro-Russian Ukrainians who then couldn't vote in the last election. And that's part of the reason why Volodymyr Zelensky is now president, because he was a pro-Western, anti-Russian leader. Since the 2014 incident, the United States and NATO have stepped up their assistance to Ukraine. And as early as 2008, they said to Ukraine that Ukraine should get on the path to joining NATO. This was clearly in Ukraine's interest. And in fact, after 2014, Ukraine rewrote its constitution. And one of the core principles of the constitution is that Ukraine will join NATO and the European Union. So these are written into the constitution of Ukraine. So in the lower left, you see American servicemen training Ukrainian military forces. And I think we can say that they have done so very successfully. It appears, based on the military strategists I'm reading, that the Ukrainian army is very effective, in part because it has adopted strategies that the NATO forces have taught them for how to fight Russian tank columns, which is let the tanks drive by you and blow up the logistics trucks, which are not going to be guarded, and then the tanks will run out of gas and you can pick them off more easily. Of course, US aid is very controversial in this country because the first impeachment of Donald Trump came about because of his phone call with Vladimir Zelensky, when Zelensky said, we need to talk to you about getting anti-tank weapons. And Trump's response was, well, first, let's talk about a favor you can do for me. And of course, there was a whole thing about Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. So US aid to Ukraine military aid flowed in under the Trump administration, but it was, of course, tied to this controversy that led to Trump's first impeachment in the House of Representatives. So that brings us then to where we are today, 2021 and 22. When this crisis started bubbling up in late 21, I was reminded of George Kennan in 1946. So in 1946, George Kennan was a high-ranking diplomat in Moscow, and Joseph Stalin gave this really aggressive speech about the start of World War III. And the Americans back in Washington wrote to the US Embassy in Moscow and said, please explain to us what Stalin's saying, because we don't understand why he's talking about World War III 6 months after World War II. And Kennan sent what's known as the long telegram, 8,000 words. I just feel sorry for whoever the typist was who had to click this thing out or teletype it, 8,000 words long. One of the key parts in Kennan's report, and this is the line that's across the bottom, is that he wondered if Stalin actually had objective information about the world. In other words, we view the world one way, but he's not seeing the same information we are. And therefore, it's going to be very hard for us to work with Stalin. And that line has stuck with me when I've been watching Putin over the last 6 months in particular, thinking he does not see the world the same way we do. And it's very clear that one of the reasons he doesn't see the world the same way is that he has insulated himself from people who disagree with him. And sometimes this is physical insulation. You've probably seen this picture if you've been paying attention over the last month or so to his National Security Council meeting. You know, nobody is close enough to breathe on him and give him COVID. He's been very paranoid about COVID, it appears. He's been almost literally in a bunker for 2 years. But you've probably also seen the various jokes like the new IKEA table, the Putin, which is 40 feet long with a chair at one end and a chair at the other end, because there are all these photographs of Putin physically distancing himself from his advisors. And, you know, the physical distance may not be a problem, although it's harder to read body language. But this concern, this paranoia about getting too close to people, I think is real. In this National Security Council meeting that Putin had before he authorized the invasion of Ukraine, he had his advisors get up one by one and tell him what they thought. And there was only one person, Sergei Naryshkin, who was the chief of foreign intelligence, who very, very calmly and tamely suggested maybe another round of negotiations with the West. And Putin just eviscerated him. And Naryshkin was not challenging anything substantive about what Putin was saying. He was just saying, maybe we should try one more time of negotiation before we resort to force. And Putin humiliated him. And this was all on film, and you could see him backing down. You almost be terrified, because if you cross Putin, well, he gets rid of you. And he doesn't just send you off to exile. We have, you know, Navalny, who's languishing in a prison in Siberia, Nemtsov, who got killed on a bridge right outside of the Kremlin 7 years ago, that Putin is pretty brutal. And so there's no reward for speaking up to him. The people around him, frankly, have gotten rich. And even with all the sanctions, maybe they've lost, you know, they had 5 billion and now they lost 4 billion. They still have 1 billion. And Putin's position is, if you want to keep the billion, you'll follow me. So he surrounded himself with yes men who are beholden to him. And therefore, I don't think he's getting an objective image of what the rest of the world was going to do. And so we have this just crazy attempt by Russia to claim that what they want to do in Ukraine is denazify Ukraine. Now, first of all, we know that the president of Ukraine is himself Jewish, Vladimir Zelensky. His grandparents on his father's side and his granduncles, some of them died in the Holocaust, some of them died fighting for Russia. The idea that Zelensky or his government is Nazi is just crazy. The Russian embassy in South Africa posted on Twitter a comment thanking South Africans for supporting them in their denazification campaign in Ukraine. And the German embassy came back with this tweet basically saying, you know, we can't let this stand. And it says at the end, we're kind of experts on Nazism in Germany. Like, this is ridiculous to call us Nazis. Now, at some level, the denazification phrase has had some legs, more than one might expect, partially because of Ukraine's history. You might have heard that the Russians occasionally refer to the Ukrainian army as Banderites. So Stepan Bandera was a pro-Nazi at times in World War II. He welcomed the Germans at first, then he fought against the Germans, clearly an anti-Semite. And he has been celebrated in Ukraine. For a while, he actually had a national honor named for him. There are stamps named for him. So there is a history in Ukraine of some pro-Nazi ideas, but a lot of that's been washed out. And it's certainly not an influence in Ukrainian politics today, but there is a history there that has caused Ukraine some problems in terms of its PR, but it doesn't rise to the level that the Russian government has claimed. As it became clear that Russia was likely to invade Ukraine, the United States and its Western allies stepped up its sanctions regime. And I think this chart here about what happened to the ruble is pretty important. You can see when Russia annexed Crimea, interesting spelling of annex, in 2014, sanctions were put in place and the ruble lost maybe about half its value. And then when Russia invaded Ukraine as a whole in 2022, and the new sanctions came into place, the ruble lost almost all of its value to the point where it's basically pieces of paper. It has no financial value outside of Russia. And when the war started, there were protests. You know, this is the thing about sanctions. Sanctions rarely hurt the people at top. What they do is they cause misery and pain throughout the country. And the hope is that the people in the country will overthrow the leaders because of the sanctions. So this was very clearly the West's decision. If Russia invaded Ukraine, the West would not fight for Ukraine. Ukraine was not in NATO. It didn't have a right to claim that support. But the United States and its allies would try to cripple the Russian economy with incredibly harsh sanctions and hope that that caused the Russian nation to collapse and that Putin would be thrown out of power because of that. That effectively was the strategy. And I think that was partially based on an assumption that Ukraine probably was not strong enough to withstand a Russian invasion. So here we are a month after the invasion, and Ukraine obviously is still standing and if anything, appears to be making progress in the war. So the map shows, some of these sort of Russian advances. To the extent that these are real advances, it's hard to say. Usually Ukrainian forces are behind the Russians as well, but also shows all the countries in the world that have offered support for Ukraine. And I'm not just talking about votes in the UN, but actual physical support, whether that's military aid or humanitarian aid, things like that. And it's most of the world really outside of Africa where there's some suspicion about, the way Russia has been framed. So I'm going to wrap up just by saying that the war in Ukraine is, in my opinion, likely to last until somebody gets rid of Vladimir Putin. And I'm not suggesting the US try to assassinate him. I'm suggesting that I think the most likely way this war is going to end is that the Russian army is going to get tired of Putin and take him out. I don't see a negotiated solution to this that Russia can accept, certainly not one that Ukraine can accept. Maybe the other alternative is that the Russian army just collapses. But the damage will be immense. The United States and other countries, I think, have a moral obligation to offer as much support as they can to rebuild Ukraine, because you see the images of what's happening in Ukrainian cities. And I think there's going to be some serious talk about war crimes trials, and there's going to be serious talk about forcing the Russians to pay reparations, which have not been done since World War II, when the Germans paid reparations to the Russians. So I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions that people have. Maybe, Carrie, do you want to be in charge of funneling the questions, or however we want to do it? I'm happy to do.
Sure. There's already one question from Sue. She's asking, how did the USSR get formed? And were all of those countries willing to become part of the USSR?
Oh, that's a great question. So the Russian Empire stretched from Vladivostok in the east into what's today modern Poland and modern Finland. And it was ran up against the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the start of World War I. In 1917, the Russian Tsarist Empire collapsed. And for the rest of 1917, there was a struggle between various forces. And Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks finally seized control of St. Petersburg and Moscow in 1917 into 1918. And signed a peace treaty with the Germans that gave up a whole lot of the territory in the western part of the Russian Empire. Basically, they bought peace by giving up land. That continued into a civil war that lasted until 1921 or so, between pro-Tsarist forces in Russia and the communist forces. So the communists eventually won that civil war, and in the process conquered a lot of places around them and sort of forced them into the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was modeled as a collection of states that came together. But I think it's fair to say that, I mean, there was never any election in Ukraine, for instance, whether or not to join the Soviet Union. It was simply which army took power. So the Soviet Union was formed really out of the revolution that caused the end of the Tsarist regime. And there were no free elections that brought it about. Frequently, it was local revolutions, and then those people decided to align themselves with Moscow for protection.
Okay, we have a question from Kathy. She asks, so do you see this invasion as inevitable because of Putin, or do you believe that there is something that could have been done to prevent it?
That's a great question. Historians get nervous when we hear inevitability because we always think there's got to be a way out of this somehow. And I think that certainly an invasion could have been avoided if the Ukrainians had just said, okay, we have no intention of joining NATO, and you can take Crimea and the Donbass region. We'll recognize those, so don't invade us. I think Putin might have said, okay, success, I've got what I want. And plus I have cowed the Ukrainians. So I've made clear who the dominant power in this relationship is. But that's not really fair to put on the Ukrainians. I'm certainly not saying they should have done that, but I think it was possible to surrender before an invasion. I think it's also possible that if the West had not signaled to the Ukrainians that they would offer support in the aftermath of 2014, Ukrainians might have been more likely to negotiate rather than risk an invasion. But I do think this is largely a product of Vladimir Putin. I think if, let's just say, Vladimir Putin had fallen off that horse when he was riding bareback bare-shirted to show how manly he was, if he had fallen off the horse and been trampled by, whatever horse was behind him, I don't think the next leader of Russia would have done the same thing, just because there would have been turnover and there would have been a new set of leaders. I really think that had there been an honest assessment within Moscow of what was going to happen in Ukraine, they would have increased the likelihood that Ukraine would actually fight, because I think they just assumed Ukraine wouldn't fight. They also would have recognized that their army was not ready to invade Ukraine. I think that nobody outside Russia knew that, but I think the commanders probably knew that the money that had been allocated to defense had not been spent on defense, that a lot of it had been siphoned off. So yeah, I think ultimately Putin is the explaining factor. I don't think that there's anything rational or reasonable that Ukraine or the West could have done to prevent this other than just surrender and give him what he wanted.
The next question is from Wendy. She asks, what is the history of palace coup in Russia?
Boy, there have not been many palace coups. So this is, I assume you mean overthrowing Putin from within, and that's sort of a palace coup. And in that sense, there hasn't been one. In the Soviet era, there were certainly power struggles among people who were roughly equal, but there was not, to my knowledge, any moment when the people below rose up and threw out the person in power. So I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. On the other hand, the Russian army has not suffered this kind of defeat since 1942, roughly. And I think if you're a Russian military commander, you've got to at least be thinking, if we get rid of Putin, we can say it's his fault and we can pull out and regroup. And maybe if we get rid of him, the punishment on us won't be too bad. And I don't think it's going to happen soon. I think at some point there are going to be some high-ranking Russian officers who make a decision that they can't tolerate Putin. And the other thing, of course, is that there's the risk in all of this that Putin might, in a moment of desperation, say, okay, fine, I'm going to shoot a tactical nuclear missile at Kyiv, Warsaw, whatever. I mean, make a decision that doesn't seem logical to us. And I think if you're a Russian military commander, you know that the answer to that's going to be nuclear missiles coming back at you. And you would probably calculate that it's better to take your chances getting rid of Putin than to let that happen. So there's not a history that I know of, which is why I'm not particularly optimistic that that's going to happen soon.
Okay, the next person asks, the Ukrainians are fighting back much harder than it seems most people expected. Do you have a sense of why the Russians underestimated this resistance?
That's a great question. And I think that is really central to the decision the Russians made. I think partially they looked at what happened in 2014 when, frankly, the Ukrainian military was not able to resist their advances. And they probably thought the Ukrainian military was a lot like their military, only smaller. And they thought, well, our military is much bigger than theirs, so we will be able to pummel them. We've got more modern equipment, we've got more tanks, more airplanes, more of everything. What I think they didn't count on, twofold. One is that the years since 2014, as I said earlier, Ukraine has had a really messy politics since 1991, but clearly this country has been coalescing around a set of values that I'll just call the liberal international order: democracy, trade with Europe, things like that. And Ukrainians have more often than not, it's not like 100% or even 80%, but more often than not have looked to Poland in one direction and Russia in the other direction. And just at a basic level, they see Poland getting rich and Russia not getting rich. They're like, well, we want to be closer to Poland than to Russia. So there's this sense that's been building over the last 8 years that Russia is not their friend. Russia has taken away territory. It's a bad role model. It's crushing Belarus. So the morale factor is just, we don't want to be part of Russia. The other thing I really don't think we can overemphasize is that training from Western armies. I talked to the Air Force ROTC cadets the other week, and what was really fascinating was to hear their commanding officers emphasize that their responsibility, first of all, they had responsibility for their troops that was primary, that they had to take care of the enlisted men before they took care of themselves. And that is not real in the Russian army. They don't think that way at all. And secondly, that they had to be able to take the initiative in a moment of crisis. And again, that's not like the Russian army at all. So I think the Russian army had a plan. They drove into Ukraine. The plan didn't work and they didn't have a plan B, and their sergeants and lieutenants didn't know what to do. And so they just sort of waited for orders. I mean, part of the reasons why we've already had 6 Russian generals get killed is because the Russian generals are coming to the front and trying to restore some sort of motion to this army that doesn't know how to move if its orders aren't being followed. So I think that the combination of Ukrainians being trained to fight small arms, small unit tactics and make decisions on their own has been a key part. Their morale that they don't want to be part of Russia has been a key part, because they still might have collapsed even with the training. And then the fact that they've gotten all these weapons, I don't think the Russians counted on being very effective. I don't think they counted on the Javelin and NLAW anti-tank weapons being nearly as good as they are. And so it's, I think maybe the Russians, if they were looking around, looked at Afghanistan and said, an army comes in, the commander runs away and the army collapses, and they thought Zelensky would run away, and he didn't run away and the army didn't collapse. So it's a complex set of factors, from morale to training to weapons the Russians didn't count on.
Kathy asks, who are the oligarchs that the media keeps talking about?
That's a great question. So, and there are oligarchs in Ukraine too. This is not just a Russian thing. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were a lot of really wonderful resources in all parts of the Soviet Union, in Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, places like that. And in almost all of these places, they're trying to figure out how to transition to a private enterprise economy. What happened was, as one historian calls, I've got a book over on my shelf here called "A Sale of the Century," that basically people with connections to the government in Moscow were able to take control with very little resources of these large revenue generating corporations like Gazprom, the national gas company, telecoms, things like that. So these were ordinary Russians who were well connected, who then basically became billionaires. And they became billionaires because they had the patronage, first of Yeltsin, but more importantly of Putin. So they are very wealthy people. They control a huge swaths of the Russian economy. These are not, even if we think of somebody like Jeff Bezos being wealthy, but there's a lot of stockholders of Amazon who have also gotten wealthy. A lot of these companies, they are owned by a small group of men who have then taken the money and made themselves wealthy. And you've probably seen these reports about all these yachts being confiscated. So one of the ways they enjoyed their billions of dollars was to buy these super yachts that they could use a little bit at the time. And then, of course, send their daughters and mistresses and sons out to school in the West. There's been this really famous story recently about Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and his stepdaughter, who's been living large in London with her Instagram account on money that basically Lavrov looted from the Russian economy. So these oligarchs are people who have brought sort of klepto capitalism, stealing capitalism to Russia, and have benefited from the centralization of power. And it's worth noting that the oligarchs could be a basis for a revolt against Putin because they are very wealthy and therefore can command resources. But in most cases, they got their wealth because of Putin. And if they even so much as hint at standing up against them, he can either throw them in jail or just take away all their wealth by using the power of the police and the courts to get rid of them. So the oligarchs are powerful, but they are still subservient to Putin.
Eric asks, can you speak to the West's reliance on Russian commodities and the leverage that provides Putin?
Yeah, so we even before the war, we knew about oil and natural gas, obviously the Nord Stream pipeline. One of the questions about why Putin did this now, I said earlier that I think that he calculated that Ukraine was getting stronger, and the longer he waited, the harder time he'd have pushing Ukraine around. But he also thought that the West was divided and not likely to stand up to him because the West needed his oil and natural gas to keep warm during the winter. And the approval of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, I think, only convinced him that the West wanted Russia's oil so much that it would do almost anything to get it. The other thing, of course, that has come out recently that I was not aware of before the war started is that Russia is a huge exporter of fertilizer. And so there are places around the world that need Russian fertilizer to be able to maintain their crop production. And those are really the two biggest commodities. But of course, Russia is a huge country. It has all sorts of minerals, like nickel, for instance, that are hard to find elsewhere in the world. So Russia does have some ability to push back by controlling these particular resources. And it's really been fascinating to watch the oil market because, it's still pretty cold in Europe. Europeans are still importing an enormous amount of carbon fuel from Russia. But the two crazy things have come out. One is that a lot of this stuff is actually crossing Ukraine. So if the Western allies stop buying it, they're actually going to stop supplying money to Ukraine and to Russia. So the Ukrainians are sort of in a bind because they want to get that money from the resources are crossing from Russia through their country to the West during the middle of a war. And then the other thing is that, to people's great surprise, Putin declared that he would only accept payment in rubles for the Russian oil and gas. And the West was like, thank you, that got us off the hook. Like, we didn't have to say we're going to boycott oil and gas. We're just not going to pay you in rubles. And that's going to stop the flow of gas and oil. I think Putin was trying to play a strong arm game. I think that in other times it might have worked, but right now the European Union is so united. I don't think the Germans can politically, for instance, afford to say, oh, okay, well, we'll do what Putin wants to keep the natural gas flowing. I think instead they're just going to have to turn the thermostats down and accept it. So Russia has some leverage, but it's not as much as they thought they had at the start of the crisis.
Cherie asks, what do you think the world leaders who are meeting right now will come up with for more sanctions?
Well, since Putin has basically cut off oil and gas with his ruble declaration, there's not much more they can do other than sanctioning people lower down the ladder, which I don't know how many of those people are likely to travel out of Russia anyhow, or what sort of resources they have outside of Russia. I think that would be largely symbolic. There's not really much else the West can do, I think, at this point. I mean, they could finalize that they won't buy oil and gas by saying themselves they're not going to, whether Putin would take, rubles, Bitcoin, barter, whatever, they won't participate. I think the only other thing they can do is clarify to Russia the red lines that they've already clarified, they've already hinted at in some places. You know, I noticed today that Joe Biden said that if there were a chemical weapons attack, there would be a response in kind, which is an interesting strategy. So I think they're going to try to deter Putin from escalating this war anymore. And there's a huge argument among people who are studying Russia and this war about how best to respond to these threats about chemical weapons and nuclear weapons. And I think they're probably arguing, you know, keep in mind that NATO has 30 members and they basically all have to agree to a policy. So, and that includes Hungary, where the Prime Minister Viktor Orban is pretty close to Putin. And then, you know, countries that are much more anti-Putin, like Estonia, which doesn't like anything Russian, and Poland doesn't like anything Russian. So trying to get any more agreement out of NATO is going to be difficult. I think more than anything, they're meeting today just to talk and make sure that they all understand each other, because they don't want to be caught in a position where Putin does something unexpected and then they have to figure out what they're going to do next. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but I think they're being very cautious right now.
Ed asks, the 2014 sanctions seemed weak. What is the difference this time, if there is one, if it's all voluntary?
The key thing is that the European states and Japan and even Switzerland, you know, normally a neutral country that would never get involved in sanctioning anybody, have all agreed to these sanctions. So the biggest problem with sanctions, so there are two problems with sanctions. One is they rarely hurt the people who are making the political decisions. I mean, you think about, you know, how long did the United States have sanctions on Fidel Castro in Cuba? And he outlived a whole lot of US presidents, even though he faced those sanctions. Sanctions on Iran since 1979, you know, like that has not changed the government in Iran. It's just caused misery in those countries. So sanctions rarely actually change policy, but they're sort of a way of saying to the sanctioned country, you know, we're getting closer and closer to a point where we might use military force. So we're going to impose some sanctions and tell you, you know, you're getting up to the line. And so the problem in 2014 was, for instance, there were a lot of countries who didn't want to cut off Russian natural resources, to come back to the earlier question, into Europe. And so the heavier the sanctions, the more the European countries were going to pay. So they were trying to find a level of sanctions that would indicate to the Russians, we don't accept this, we're unhappy about this. But they didn't want to set sanctions so high that the Europeans would end up squawking about it, because they didn't think they'd change Russian policy. So this round, I think the Biden administration deserves an enormous amount of credit for getting countries lined up to, for instance, cut off Russians from the banking system. So one of the reports we've seen is that the Russians built up a hard currency reserve, that's non-rubles, of $600 billion. But because of the sanctions, $300 billion of those are no longer available to the Russian economy because they've cut off the banking transfer systems that were so useful. So right there, that sanction has done an enormous amount of damage to the Russian economy. And then the unwillingness of anybody around the world to do business with Russia. I mean, every company that still does business gets a lot of public pressure. That makes it harder for Russia to get anything from foreign currency to just spare parts. I saw the other day that the Russian aerospace industry is basically shut down because they can't get the machine tools and parts they need to build things. So these are probably the toughest economic sanctions that have ever been put into place. They are so far united, but we're only 30 days in. And we know from the history of sanctions that after 3 months or 6 months, countries start saying, well, we've done our part. The sanctions haven't changed things. So now, you know, we're going to quietly start making deals on the side and we dare you to stop us. So these sanctions they go much deeper in terms of who individually is sanctioned, much deeper in the banking system, and then much deeper in what can be traded across borders. And the 2014 sanctions, a lot of people have said we missed our opportunity, we should have done more. I mean, that seems like Monday morning quarterbacking to me. People were not willing to risk a war for Ukraine in 2014.
The last question we have in the chat is from Ellie. She asks, wasn't part of Russia's agreement to reunification of Germany based on NATO's agreement not to expand to Ukraine? Did NATO renege?
That's a good point. There's a lot of discussion about this. Among other people, Kozyrev, the former foreign minister of Russia, Mikhail Gorbachev, have both said that there was no promise to them that NATO would not expand into Ukraine. In 2008, they were very clear. NATO was very clear that Ukraine was on a path to join NATO. And in fact, if anything, one of the criticisms might be that they didn't expedite getting Ukraine into NATO, but I think they worried that there would be a crisis if they pushed it harder. I would say that the main thing that's changed regarding NATO since 2008 is the change in the Ukrainian constitution, saying that membership in NATO is one of the goals that they have set out. And so I think at that point, yes, the Russians believe that the West sort of forced NATO on them. But at the same time, the response from NATO would be, Ukrainians have a right to decide who their allies are. Russians don't have that right for them. So I don't think the West ever made any promises that it wouldn't expand into Ukraine or other countries. And so I don't think the Russians quite have a leg to stand on. I would agree that in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the idea of Ukraine joining NATO would have been way off anybody's radar. So there's been a gradual transition to how far east NATO can go. But I don't think the Russians ever had a firm promise from the West.
Thank you. I think that might be the last question, unless anyone has anything additional.
You can even unmute and ask a question that way if you want. No questions about the no-fly zone. I thought for sure there'd be somebody asking whether we should do that. So.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Dorsey. I really appreciate your being here and sharing your knowledge with all of us.
It was my pleasure, and I appreciate all the great questions, and I thank you all for coming out on this evening. And I know you got to sit around. It's March Madness. There's basketball to be watched, so I appreciate you coming and listening. And feel free. I'm going to give a similar presentation for the Durham Library online on Tuesday. If you know people you think would be interested, certainly welcome to come to that. And then I'll be in Epsom in person in April. And I'm always happy to talk to people further about this.
Terrific. Thank you. And
Thank
thanks
you.
everyone.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.